Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson, and welcome to our Tools, Techniques, and Mental Models for Success series. Today we're going to be looking at playing the short game and long game. We're going to kind of compare and contrast some of the things that we discussed in previous episodes regarding goal setting and prioritization, how change is influencing how we're doing things, and how it affects businesses and how it affects projects, by and large how it affects your time as well. So we'll be also diving into what's known as the Eisenhower Matrix with regards to time management. So we'll be looking at both time and cost and goal setting and really thinking about things both short and long term. You'll see that in project management and business management, short and long-term thinking are very important, and often they kind of work against each other, as it does in your own personal life as well. And we'll give some examples and compare and contrast that. So I think the analogy of golf is a pretty good analogy when we think about the short game and the long game, especially when we think about some of the instances where one thing is ignored at the expense of something else. I remember this shot was when I actually won closest to the pin at a home building golf tournament a few years back, and the drive got very, very close to the pin. I actually won it, which is unusual in golf because I'm not necessarily known for being the best golfer in the world, but it was a nice shot. And that was playing the long game. It got very, very close to the pin, and I did actually sink it in the next shot. Well, it's hard to miss that next shot when you look at it, but when you think about the short game, that's in golf, it's putting and chipping onto the green. And the long game would be driving, hitting the ball, 200 plus yards, and being able to get it in an accurate way close towards where the pin is. You could be really good at driving and horrible at putting, and overall, you're not going to be a great golfer. Conversely, you could be wonderful at the short game, chipping and putting, but horrible at driving. You're still not going to be a great golfer. So you have to kind of have both work together, or it could cause you some severe problems in golf for sure. And we'll think about that in terms of business as well. So we can think about the short game as being something that's more imminent, more immediate. And again, that can vary. We could even have an extra one here if we wanted to and get into the medium game, but I'm going to try and keep it simple by having the short and long game in this aspect. So thinking more immediate versus thinking into the future. And to be sure, some businesses think more in the short term than in the long term. And sometimes they need to because there's something going on that requires their immediate attention. But working only in the short term without thinking about the long term can cause some drastic issues and consequences for business as well. We talked about change in one of the earlier episodes, and if you're focusing just in the short term all the time, you might miss the forest for the trees. Your whole industry could be changing and you really haven't taken the steps to take advantage of that, and then you're very vulnerable to the change that has occurred, and then you're backtracking and it may be difficult to catch up. So everything has pluses and minuses. I'm not here to say you got to look at the long game and forget about the short game, or you got to forget about the short game and look at the long game. You got to think about both and how they're going to play out. And when you're thinking about goals, you have to think about both the short and the long game. So from a goals perspective, and if you will follow business very much, especially publicly traded companies, there's a lot of pressure on CEOs to ensure that they're getting profit, meeting the profit expectations and forecasts for the short term. And if they don't meet those forecasts, then that usually has a negative impact on the share price. And that means that shareholders aren't happy, and that can affect the CEO's bonus, that can affect their job, literally. Conversely, if they're only thinking about the short game and they're not thinking about the long game, they could make investments in things to prop up how their profits look in the next quarter or the next year, and fail to catch an opportunity that might take 3 to 5 years to develop because they didn't invest that money now, or they didn't set that as a priority. So you'll hear that very often in publicly traded businesses, that the company missed their expectations or their forecasts and the stock has fallen. Or you might hear that a company went bankrupt and they missed this big opportunity of change in technology. And why didn't they invest in that particular area? Usually at the root of it, there's some other pressures that were taking place, and decisions were made at the cost of one or the other, the short game or the long game, which obviously if we're discussing that and it's in the news, it probably wasn't a good decision. So we have to think both in terms of time and money. So things, short game is time issued, but we also have to think about our money and our availability to it. And what are the implications and risks that are involved with either decision, right? So you want to do a analysis, and you want to make sure that you've walked through the various decisions, and you want to make sure that you're not compromising certain opportunities that may actually be detrimental to the business, detrimental to the person, and could have been avoided completely by just thinking about in terms of short and long game risks that are available. Some examples you can probably think about or understand: banks and the financial crisis of 2008. So if we go back to 2008, talking about goals, there was a lot of financial incentives for CEOs, for people working within companies, for corporate strategies to meet certain profit margin targets, and a lot of extrinsic rewards in the form of bonuses were provided. And so what happened was they were playing the short game, which, understanding that the market would be okay and it's not too bad, and kind of betting the company on it, if you will. So banks and the financial crisis of 2008, really it had this cascading effect, or house of cards effect, that caused a lot of problems for industries, and companies that have been around 100 plus years, like Lehman Brothers, went under. A lot of banks got through it for the simple reason they didn't have what they call moral hazard. Moral hazard is when a business is somewhat protected against making dumb moves, and the government stepped in too big to fail, those kind of things, because if it fails, it causes a domino effect to other industries and unemployment, etc. But small businesses that got caught up in that definitely suffered as a result of those consequences. So playing the short game as opposed to a long game. And the small businesses, they probably were too heavily invested, too leveraged in those particular areas, that when something changed, they weren't able to manage their way out of it. And I'm thinking of examples like home building industry, things of that nature, where they, at that time in the United States, they were building a lot of houses on speculation. That meant that they hadn't even sold them yet. Or even if they had, with the deposits they had, people walked away from the houses. And so all those investments, which were highly leveraged, they had no way to pay for it. So that caused a lot of bankruptcies in the home building sector. Car companies, same sort of idea. They do really, really well when things are booming. They make a lot of profit when things are booming, but often they pay out a lot of that profit to shareholders and bonuses and other aspects, or they even, accept union rates that are very, very high to pay. They can pay them when things are booming, but as soon as things go downhill, they're compromised. So it's usually a combination of variables in there. They want to settle a union contract so they don't go out on strike, and then they settle for something that's affordable at that time, but as soon as the market goes south, they can't afford those high rates anymore. It puts the company in jeopardy. And of course, paying executives too much in the way of bonuses and perhaps dividends to shareholders, etc. So not having enough in reserve, that means that they're not ready for a short-term downturn. They haven't protected themselves enough. I think about Kodak. I mentioned that in an earlier episode because I did a lot of construction work for them over the years. Our company did, and they were vastly invested in film, and they really didn't, even though they invented the digital camera, they really did not invest enough in that they could have been leaders in that sector or leaders in those technologies, and so it kind of cost them at the time. And now I think about two people in general, and this is a tougher one, people in general. You can play the short game and the long game. You can think about it. Everybody knows people that sort of life is short and they want to enjoy themselves. And so as soon as they make some money, go on a trip, buy the best car, buy the best sofa, whatever, enjoy today because you don't know what tomorrow brings, right? And those people are not 100% wrong in that. Life is a very complicated mix of events. So there is that sort of viewpoint. Then there's those that would play the long game. And in the long game, they would be looking at, well, I want to make sure that I can retire. I don't want to have to worry about being able to pay my bills. I want to live a nice life in retirement, etc. So I'm going to put that kind of enjoyment off till later in life. And so they're not necessarily wrong either. Of course, if they get hit by a bus tomorrow, they probably would have wished they had played the short game. And the people that play the short game, they end up living till their 90s, and they're kind of out of money when they're in their 60s. They're kind of wishing that they had put some money away. So you can kind of see that it's important to consider both viewpoints when you look at it from that perspective. That's the short game and the long game. Other companies that I see, in the long game, and we can even talk about that a little bit, Disney or Walt Disney, how they've been able to adapt and change. They're one of the companies that was reviewed in a book called Built to Last, and that book was written in the early 1990s, and even since then, Disney's done a lot of sort of proactive things, including getting into the whole comic book era and the Marvel comics, and purchasing that and making a whole bunch of blockbuster movies, buying Pixar and some of the content and expertise that they have. They've also done other things like getting into the cruise industry and travel association. So they've done a lot of different things, although I suspect in some of those sectors they're hurting right now because of the pandemic that has occurred. So that's obviously something that would be at issue. But they have really sort of diversified themselves, and they have looked at both the short and the long game, I think, pretty well as a company overall. I kind of like Amazon too, if you follow them from the perspective of playing the long game. They try a lot of different things. And so from the long game perspective, I think Bezos is saying you have to take risks, and you're going to fail at a number of things, which they have failed at a number of things, but they've had some pretty big successes as well. And one of the points that Bezos made was you want to ensure that you take risk, but don't. I think don't be the company, don't bet the company is what I should have said there. So you don't want to bet the company in those kind of aspects, and we know that a lot of people do bet the company, and maybe without even realizing that they're betting the company. So, and in construction, it happens a lot. In development, it happens even more. Development, you're buying properties, and a big part of increasing your return on investment, we'll look at that in another episode, is if you can leverage those returns. But leveraging also means you're adding to risk. And you can get caught very easily when there's a major global event like a financial crisis of 2008, like the dot-com bust of 2001, like the current, more recent pandemic. So these are things that can really sort of catch companies that weren't necessarily expecting it, but these things tend to happen on an ongoing basis about every 10 to 15 years apart, and the severity can vary, right? So we want to think about both the short game and the long game. So somebody that was kind of covering themselves, if you want to think about it on a personal perspective, it's probably the easiest to explain, is if possible, if they've been working and they've been making a decent career for themselves, then they would have put money aside so that if there is a downturn, they have some liquidity. So you have enough money to get through a period of time. The longer the period of time, the better, or whatever your comfort zone personally is with that. But certainly, if you've only got enough to get by for the next 2 weeks, I would say that's not enough, right? You'd want to look at, well, what are you comfortable with? And, you can listen to a variety of experts on this, and I don't want to profess to be an expert on the time frame, but you might hear 3 months, 6 months, a year, something of that nature. If you're able to build up that kind of store before you start leveraging or risking everything, then that's something that you would want to consider. And then you're balancing the short game and the long game. And it also enables you to take a little bit more risks without being too nervous, as long as you've protected a certain amount of liquidity that you're satisfied with personally. Having properties is great, but in a financial crisis, you probably can't sell the property, or if you have to sell the property, you have to sell it at a loss. So you want to make sure you can get through the storm so that you don't have to make fire sales on assets that you have, both personally or in a business perspective. And those typically are the ones that come out the other side even stronger. There's some developers that I know that they really were able to expand quite substantially after a financial crisis, because usually just as you're getting towards the other side, they still have that capital put aside, and they have some golden opportunities that they can start to look for these opportunities to invest some of that capital in, because they survived to the other side. Otherwise, they would have lost everything and they didn't survive to the other side. So it's definitely, you don't want to sink with the ship. You want to be able to keep the ship afloat long enough till it can be repaired and you can get yourself to the other side. So the short game versus the long game is definitely thinking about things in those terms. You can also think about how we prioritize our time, and that kind of fits into short-term thinking and long-term thinking. So there's this excellent matrix, and it's named after Eisenhower. So that'd be Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led United States in World War II, five-star general, was president of the United States, had a lot of good ideas and a lot of good ways of doing things, and he's kind of credited with this. It may have come from somebody else that he worked with. A lot of these things tend to get named with the person that really kind of mentioned it and pronounced it as being a positive aspect of management. So we'll call it the Eisenhower Matrix to be sure. Stephen Covey has a similar one as well, which is same sort of matrix idea. So if we think about this, and by the way, Stephen Covey wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, an excellent book if you are interested. So the Eisenhower Matrix, it's really broken up into these 4 areas, and you can sort of see it on the screen, and it's important and urgent, important, not urgent, and it also has not important, so not important and urgent, not important and not urgent. So there's these 4 quadrants, if you will. And he kind of mentioned how things work and how the matrix kind of works together and how people do things. And so we all have things that are important, but they're not necessarily that they have to be done today. You've got a certain amount of time frame with it. Then there's things that are important, but you really need to do it now. It's very important for you to get it done now. And then we have things that are important and urgent. Usually these things are things like not important and urgent. And so these things that are not important and urgent, probably they're not important to you, but the reason they're urgent, they might be important to somebody else, right? So to you, it might not be that urgent, but to somebody else, it may be urgent. So it could be a subcontractor if you're working on a construction site and they need you to move something out of their way so that they can get something done, but to you, they're not on the critical path, and so you're not feeling it's that urgent. Probably I would say, though, from long-term relationship point of view, that would probably be better to get that moved, especially if it did delay your project for any other reason, or there's some repercussions down the road, then I would move that into important and urgent. But you might want to do it just because of the long-term relationship aspect. So it's a short-term thing to do, but it's a long-term relationship aspect that will provide benefits by doing it. You don't want to be a schmuck by not necessarily doing it. And then we have the 4th, actually we have the bottom right, the yellow one, which is not important, not urgent. So the not important, not urgent, which is down here, this is probably, you could name any one of a dozen things that really, they're not doing anything for you. Looking at Facebook, social media, just time is being wasted. Clicking on some of these distractors on your smartphone, wasting time in certain websites is not really benefiting you any long-term benefits. What it is tending to give you some short-term gratification. I'm not saying it doesn't. A lot of people, they get a certain amount of happiness by clicking and seeing what their friends are doing on Facebook, etc. So there is definitely that short-term gratification. It's almost like a cake, right? So it's nice, it's short-term gratification, but if you eat enough of it long-term, it's going to have an impact on you. So that's not important, not urgent. And then we have important, not urgent. Important, not urgent, it's significant. So important, not urgent, I would think about that like things like, for me, writing a textbook. That takes a lot of time, and it's not urgent like I have to, if I miss a day on writing this book, it's not the end of the world. So it's important but not urgent. But the problem with important, not urgent is very often it's never gets done because other things fill its time. If I'm scrolling along or watching TV, Netflix, and I'm hooked on a show and I'm watching hour and hour after of this particular show, maybe this important, not urgent thing never ends up getting done if it's something like a book or something like that. Or maybe what happens is this important, not urgent thing, which I had lots of time to do, all of a sudden becomes important and urgent because I procrastinated it and left it too long. So in that case, it moves from long-term to short-term. So you can sort of see how short-term versus long-term thinking comes into play here, right? From a business perspective, like the examples we just gave on the last slide, but also from a to-do list of prioritization. What are the most important things for me to do? And if we look at this quadrant and we really think about it, what should be taking the most of our time? Think about that for a moment, because we've got four choices here. We've got important, urgent, we've got important, not urgent, we've got not important, urgent, and we've got not important, not urgent. Like if we're really managing our time well, which of these should be taking most of our time and effort? Well, if you answered, so we've got important, urgent, and we've got important, not urgent. These would be the 3 points, and following these 2 quadrants, that would be of the most important. This one can be also pretty important as well, depending on what the not important thing is. Like if it's not, the only reason it's urgent, there's got to be somebody that's pushing you for that, right? Otherwise it would be over here in the important, not urgent. So it depends on the relationship and how you're trying to satisfy somebody in that area. But if we're really thinking about it and we want to prioritize, then we should be thinking about in this zone here that we want to expand the important and not urgent as much as possible. So when we think about that in time management, the short game versus the long game, the goal is to maximize important, not urgent, while minimizing the not urgent, not important. You can't get, we've got to have also some short-term buzz. If that bit of social media gives you a buzz and makes you happy in the very short term, you got to have some of that. You just don't want that to be the overall controlling amount of what you're doing, because over the long term you'll have some regrets about that. So if you really want to maximize your area of achieving goals, and we talked about high level goals, they tend to be important and not urgent and take time, and they take a certain amount of effort and drive towards achieving. Important and urgent, it's good to minimize this where possible. So if we have enough time for something, we really don't want to procrastinate something here and make it become important and urgent, because that's stressful. I don't want to be having a pile of things that are important and urgent, because it's going to stress me and beyond what would be healthy. And that's going to raise my blood pressure, and it's going to make me more tense. And I'm not going to be my best self interacting with others, especially if I'm managing a business or I'm managing projects and I'm interacting with a lot of people. To be at my best self, I really need to have this zone under control and have this one minimized. There's always going to be things that jump out at you that you didn't expect to happen in business. The pandemic, that would be a huge one. That would mean that it's important and urgent for you to change your plans, to adjust things so that you can take advantage of some opportunities that may be coming up. minimize some of the damage that's going on. There's a whole bunch of things. Attend to your people so that they feel comfortable. There'd be a whole pile of things under this in that particular case. So those are, and we'll talk about this in another session, but those are really what we'd call more black swan events, things that are unknown unknowns, things we didn't expect. So they're going to come up. No matter how good you are, you're going to have them. You just don't want them to be running your life, running your projects, or running your business. The not important urgent, I've already kind of said. Again, who is this for? How important is it to them? I don't want to be a schmuck, but at the same time, we have priorities and there's things that we want to focus on. Maybe we can help them by getting somebody else to help them, recommending, referring somebody else. That can always be helpful as well. So not important, not urgent, we try to make smaller as well. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the Eisenhower Matrix, because it really, I feel like it really brings together the short versus the long term and helps you to understand prioritization and helps you understand how each one can kind of pull and push each other as well. So when we think about the short term versus the long term, you can see how they interact. And usually these are the big goals. These are where your big goals are housed in the important, not urgent, because they take a long period of time. They have a bunch of serious inputs to get them done. And you may have some important and urgent things come out of that. But by and large, this is where your meat and potatoes for meeting the future that you desire, or where you want to drive the business, or how you want to get that project complete on that time, cost, quality, scope, constraint aspect that we were discussing. These are all elements that come into play. So short game and the long game. At the same time, I'm not telling you to freeze up and not to do things. I'm telling you to have a good understanding how they work together. And as Wayne Gretzky once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So you're looking at, well, what is the shot I want to take? Well, this is where my priority with the shot is. This is the goal. Remember in previous sessions when we looked at goals, you have a limit to how many goals you can go after. Don't go crazy with 1 million goals. Where is your priority? And make sure you take that shot. Make sure that you go after it. Make sure that you manage your time so that you can effectively take that shot and have a really good chance of scoring the goal, meeting the goal. So the short versus the long game, or the short and the long game, how they mesh together. It's good, healthy thinking from a project management perspective, from a business management perspective, and from a personal management perspective. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be posting approximately weekly with new episodes that we can build this community together. And don't be afraid to leave a comment as we look to improve as we move forward. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. I'm Tom Stephenson. Bye for now.